In this second podcast on the primary sources for Second Temple Judaism, I'm going to look at kind of two broad collections. The first is going to be the Dead Sea Scrolls, probably one of the most significant finds, in the last, few years, certainly in the last 100 years, for as far as New Testament studies is concerned, has been the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's a wonderful story about it that I won't labor on it here, but they were discovered in the 1940s and began to come to light in the 50s and 60s, and there are thousands of fragments and scrolls that just unleashed a new understanding of the types of Jews that existed in the first century BCE and in the first century CE. And so this is a very important collection to get an insight into a particular group or groups. Some of the sources that we have amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a source known as the Community Rules, which basically kind of gives instructions about the people who lived out at the site where the scrolls were found. The site is known as Qumran, and it is by the Dead Sea. And there was some kind of community that lived there. Not consistently there. Archaeological remains seem to indicate that there were different phases for life out there at Qumran, and that there have been some things that maybe have interrupted existence. We're still not even quite sure if people always lived out there or if it was, kind of a temporary place that some people went to for a period of time. But anyway, the Community Rule book indicates how the community should operate and some of the procedures and policies for life in the community. So we have things like known as the Manual of Discipline is one of these community rules. Now you'll see there the designation 1QS. These are the ways in which the Dead Sea Scrolls are enumerated. The 1 there indicates in which caves. So there are many caves at Qumran which these scrolls were found. The Q stands for Qumran, and S obviously stands for scroll. So 1QS, Cave 1 at Qumran scroll. Then there is what's known as the Zadokite document, designated by the letter CD. And the term Zadokite refers to a priesthood, and this helps us to understand that the people connected to the Qumran community has some kind of priestly connection, and that may help us to understand as well its history and origin. Certainly appreciate its emphasis on cultic activities, its relationship to the temple. Then there's also a document known as the Messianic Rule, so 1QSA. And so here is what the life after the Messiah comes, and what the existence, the behaviors, the expectations of the people in that rule, in that stage. We also have worship material. So we've got something known as the Psalm Scroll, 1QH. H stands for like hymn. And so the Psalm Scrolls. We also have eschatological speculations. So we have something known as the War Rule, 1QM. And so these this source here kind of understands the preparation for a final battle that is going to take, in which members of the communities are going to participate in that battle. and what will happen in that battle. So it's kind of like a revelation of what God's plan is and how this community is going to participate in that plan. We also have biblical interpretations. This is a fascinating material because it allows us to see how a particular group of Jews sought to understand their world and what was happening in events and in circumstances in their lives, and how they were connecting those events with things that they were seeing in Scripture. So we see things like a commentary on Nahum. So you see the designation there, 4Q. So this is in cave 4 at Qumran, and it's been numbered as 169. There is a commentary on Habakkuk. So you'll see 1Q, and then you'll see a P there, and then the HAB stands for Habakkuk. The P stands for the term Pesher, Pesher, Pesher. And Pesher is a form of interpretation where they see something, oftentimes in prophetic materials, and they say, this stands for this. In other words, what the prophet is talking about, we see or recognize in this particular event, or it refers to what happened here. So a pesher is a type of biblical interpretation. And here is an example of this type of interpretation being applied to Habakkuk. Other things that we also find at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find something known as the copper scroll, because it's made on copper. And so that's why it's called that. We also have a temple scroll talking about the temple and its liturgy. And we also have a very fascinating source known as Melchizedek. So this is 11Q, Melchizedek, so in Cave 11 at Qumran. So people who are familiar with the New Testament, particularly with the book of Hebrews, will know that in Hebrews, Jesus is kind of seen as a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And, up until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this was quite a curious thing to choose, of all things, Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a pretty minor figure in the Old Testament. He is this priest who blesses Abraham. He is mentioned in a psalm. And so, not much more is known about the Melchizedek figure. And here we had in Hebrews, the Hebrew author is drawing this comparison with Jesus and Melchizedek. And then all of a sudden we find that at the Qumran material, they too had a focus on Melchizedek. So becoming aware of how Melchizedek played as an important figure in at least another Jewish community besides the Jewish Christian community is quite fascinating. Begin to speculate then how or what conversations may have occurred between the author of Hebrews and maybe people who saw this document on Melchizedek as, divine, or having some kind of holy status, or having important insight. So 11Q Melchizedek is really a fascinating piece of material. Now, the other question, so this is just very briefly introducing you to a very huge area. Certainly in your assigned readings, you'll see more about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll have an opportunity to come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls later on in the course. Another group of literature I'll highlight at this moment is rabbinic literature. So when we talk about rabbinic literature, we're talking about the literature produced by individuals who are designated with the title of rabbi. So rabbi basically means teacher. And so what happened after AD 70 was the temple had been destroyed. The priesthood that was, the primary way of defining, uh, this religion and these people, through who went to this temple and who was accepted as being able to participate in the worship of the God in this temple. Well, since that was no longer available, these teachers of the law um, tried to help Jewish survival in the absence of a temple, help to give definition to what it means to be a good Jew, was interpreting the law and encouraging how it should be applied, how it should be observed by what they would see as faithful Jews. And so several things are kind of grouped into rabbinic literature. As far as reconstructing Second Temple Judaism is concerned, one of the most important is Mishnah. Now you'll see the dates here for Mishnah. Mishnah is from 90 to 200 CE. Now it was codified, meaning it was put into some kind of book form around the end of the 2nd century. Usually attributed to a fellow by the name of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. And so but it may have material. There may be what's contained in there, material that goes back to teachers who lived. Now, many teachers are named who existed in the Second Temple period. But of course, reading Mishnah that was codified at the late 2nd century about views that were held prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, you have to engage in this quite carefully, because very oftentimes what can be happening is views are attributed to older teachers that they may not have had, but they are in line with what teachers of a later period had. And so if you can say that a teacher of an earlier period had a view, that lends authority to a view that you currently have. So nevertheless, there is a great deal of scholarship trying to sift through Mishnah and arguing about what's historically reliable, as going back to some of these people who lived in the Second Temple. So Mishnah. Another source is Gemara. Gemara is basically a commentary on Mishnah. So you have Mishnah that is kind of a collection of rabbinic debates that are going on. They're divided into tractates, and we see different subject matters. Everything from Sabbath observance to food laws to marriages and to dealing with the dead. Festivals, all kinds of subjects are debated. And the way in which Mishnah is constructed is just one debate after another, and very oftentimes not concluding the debate. The debate remains open. And so Gemara then is a commentary upon what the rabbis are debating. So we have Gemara, Talmud. Now, Talmud is interesting. You basically have two Talmuds. You have what's known as the Babylonian Talmud, and you have a Palestinian Talmud, or Jerusalem Talmud. So, Talmud is basically the combination of both Mishnah and Gemara. So, Talmud is what is read and debated and discussed and taught in much of what is rabbinic Judaism today, amongst the different branches of Judaism today. So now Talmud comes much later. We're talking now into the 6th century later. And so this is far removed from Second Temple Judaism, but again, some of the material in there, there is some discussions about whether or not this material might actually reflect views and ideas that were held in the um, in the first century. But you'd want to be extremely cautious about just reading something in Talmud that is ascribed to somebody who lived in the Second Temple period and just claim that, well, what's here is accurate. Got to be more judicious in how you weigh the evidence. Also, there are targums. So targums are basically kind of free paraphrases of the Old Testament. And so we begin to see how scripture is interpreted by the ways in which different authors want to paraphrase passages of scripture. We also see in the New Testament paraphrasing that goes on, where a an author might decide to, we would say, cite a biblical text, but when we look at what is cited as the text, and then we compare it with the Masoretic text, it's quite different than what we see in the Masoretic text. And since our New Testament authors write in Greek, when you compare what they wrote, Scripture says, with what's in the Septuagint, it also varies from the Septuagint. So sometimes what we have is either some kind of independent tradition of biblical text, distinct from the Septuagint and distinct from the Masoretic, or we have New Testament authors that might be engaging in some kind of paraphrasing of them. And as they're paraphrasing, that too helps to see how they are interpreting text. So that gives us then a kind of view of brief introduction to the Dead Sea as primary sources and rabbinic material as primary sources or available for getting toward primary sources. And that ends the second podcast for this introduction to primary sources.